Well, welcome, Tawnie Olson. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to dig into your music for our Christmas concert. And I know some of your music has been done in Vancouver, but I don't think your choral stuff has really made it here yet.
No, I did have a reading many years ago, but that was just a workshop. It wasn't a performance.
So for those of our audience and our choral community who may not be familiar with you, let's start with you. Where did you come from? How did you get to be an award-winning composer?
Well, I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and came down to the States to do a 2-year master's degree. And long story short, I'm still here in the US, living in Connecticut. I'm still a Canadian citizen. I'm not a US citizen. I'm here on a green card. So I still feel very Canadian, and that's where my heart is. So
You mentioned your parents were not super musical, so you didn't grow up on music that much. So how did you end up doing a degree at Yale, one of the best places in North America for music, right?
we did have a piano. It had belonged to my great grandparents, and I always noodled around on it. And I expressed that I wanted piano lessons and I wanted flute lessons and that kind of thing. But my mom really wanted me to be a dancer. So I had a lot of dance lessons. And finally, when I was 9, I got piano lessons. And when I was 12, I got to play flute in the band. And then when I was 14, I got flute lessons. So I did. And of course, and I also quit dance entirely when I started junior high. Sorry, Mom. Um, so I just kind of was very persistent. Like I decided I wanted to play the flute when I was 5, and I held on to that till I was 12, which is a long time in the life of a child. Like I really was just very single-minded. This is what I want to do. Um, and I think somehow in high school, I just felt I played in the band and I had friends who sang in choirs. I, at that point, was not singing at all. I was just an instrumentalist. And it just became clear to me more and more that I really wanted to become a musician. And unfortunately, as I started practicing more, I managed to injure myself. So I did enter my undergrad degree at the University of Calgary as a flutist, but it quickly became clear. I could only play at one point. My physical therapist would let me play 5 minutes at a time, 3 times a day. Wow. That was it. So yeah, you cannot be a professional musician and practice 15 minutes a day in 5-minute chunks. And I am doing a lot better now, but during COVID, I've started playing the piano a little, and I really can't do more than about 15 minutes even now of piano before, it gets distracting. The pain is a little bit too distracting and I can't focus. So I need to do something else. And I had always composed. And in high school, I had a wonderful piano/composition teacher named Janice McCubbin. And although I hadn't thought of becoming a composer, in my first year at the University of Calgary, I was in David Eagle's theory class, and he made everybody write pieces. And he told my flute teacher that he thought my piece was really great and sort of suggested I might think about studying composition. And then I was working on my second piece for that class when I think I just realized that somehow, as frustrating and and annoying as the process of composing is, I think I threw the music across the room a couple times writing that piece. I still just thought, this is what I want to do. This is it. So that's, luckily for me, Ellen Bell, who was chair of the department, let me major in composition and was very supportive. I was the only woman in studying composition at the University of Calgary at that point, but he made it clear that there had been women who'd been there before and there would be women after, and if any of my male colleagues gave me any trouble, just come to him and he would sort them out. And of course, I was so naive. I thought, why would my male colleagues give me any trouble? there isn't any sexism in music, is there? In composition? Yeah, no, that was how little I knew. But again, it was a wonderful supportive environment, and I was really, I worked my tail off, and I had such good teachers, and I studied, and luckily for me, I think they must have written really good letters of reference, which is how I got into Yale. Towards the end of my master's degree here, or actually no, in my artist diploma degree down here, I started singing in the Yale Camerata. Because I did my arts diploma through the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, which is affiliated with the School of Music, so I still studied with composition professors at the School of Music, took courses there, but also attended the Institute of Sacred Music seminar, did a project for that, and was able to explore some of my interest in sacred music a little more. But because I ended up living here, I then kept singing in the Camerata because it's an audition group, but it includes community members as well as students. So I developed a really close relationship with Marguerite Brooks, who was the founder of the Yale Camerata, and who conducted it right up until last spring when she retired.
Nice, good timing.
So she commissioned Scel from me. She was the one responsible for getting the money from the Institute of Sacred Music to commission that piece, and she has given first performances of many of my choral works, and has just been an incredibly supportive mentor. So she's really a big part of the reason why I've written so much choral music, is that I was writing for people I was singing with, which was really great. And also I knew that things would get performed because, Maggie and I would go for tea every spring, and she'd say, "Have you written anything this year?" And I would say, "Well, actually, yes." And I would hand her a score, and she would take a sip of her coffee and flip through and say, "Oh yeah, this would be great for our Advent concert or for our spring concert." And there we go, it would be on the program for the next year. So having that experience, and also the experience of performing my own music, feeling what it's like to sing it in a choir, and getting feedback from other choristers, I think really, really impacted me and really shaped where I ended up. I do still write a lot of instrumental music, but I think I know that I would not have written anything like the volume of choral music that I've done if not for Maggie. And certainly Skszl would not exist if it weren't for Maggie Brooks and her commission.
Well, and it's fascinating because you mentioned how challenging a piece it is, and it is. It's certainly difficult, but it's also very singable. Like it's not pushing the voice in a place that it doesn't want to go, right? Which is sometimes a challenge for us in new music, and I think singing with your friends and being in the ensemble yourself would have a big impact on that, on the singability of your work.
Yeah, and in fact, when I was first working on the piece, at that point I was only singing in the larger chorus. I wasn't singing in the smaller chamber chorus. And so I sent some sketches to Maggie, and she said, "Oh, this is really challenging." I said, "Yeah, but I don't have to sing it." And she said, "Guess again, you're in the chamber chorus now." So that was my introduction to the chamber chorus. I didn't have to audition. I just had to write a hard piece. But then I will admit that some of the complexities did get toned down a bit once I knew I had to sing it too. But yeah, I am not a trained singer. I have had voice lessons, and I'm not a soloist. I don't have any ambitions in that direction. So when I write for voice, I think about what I would want to do. And because I don't really enjoy being pushed in the limits of my range, and yeah. I don't like that. And my goal as a composer is certainly not to hurt anyone's voice or to make them feel uncomfortable physically. Like, I just don't think that music should cause physical pain or physical damage to people. So I try to avoid doing that. So I'm glad that you observed that, because it is, the challenge of my music is usually a mental challenge of counting, and certainly in Scel, ensemble and counting are, I think, the two main challenges. There are some challenges in terms of the pitch material, although I think the harp helps out quite a lot in that department.
So you're an award-winning composer of opera and of story. Certainly in lots of the other pieces that you've sent me, there's a lot of story there. Where do you go, and what draws you to these meatier texts and these longer stories?
Well, in the case of Scel, my connection to that text is, it's a very strange story, but after Maggie and I had tea, and she said she wanted to commission a piece for me for the chamber choir and between 1 and 3 instruments, and she wanted it for the Advent concert. I went home and I started to think about it, and the commission was several years out when she approached me. And then I got an email saying, "Well, I really want to know by Friday what your text is and what the instrumentation is." And I thought, I have 5 other pieces to write before I write this piece. You want me to come up with an idea? But then I was just not even sitting down composing. I was just doing some ordinary task, and I heard this sound that seemed very wintry and cold, and I could hear a harp. And somehow I felt that the text that was being sung was not in English. so that the audience wouldn't immediately, there would not be an unmediated connection to the text. You'd have to like read a translation or put aside the translation and just sort of enjoy the atmosphere. And I felt that, okay, this text is about winter and about cold, maybe. I didn't think it was about death, which try to find a poem about winter where it's not a metaphor for death. It's pretty challenging. There's a lot of winter equals age and death poems out there. And so I searched and searched, and the deadline was approaching, and I was on the verge of giving up. And I think it was Friday, the day I was supposed to give her the information. And I met my husband for lunch. And after lunch, we went to a used bookstore, and I wandered over to the poetry section and pulled this collection of Irish verse off the shelf and opened it. And the first thing I saw was the text of Scel. And I thought, this is my text. Yeah. Here it is. This is exactly, this is what I wanted. And so of course I bought the book, and then I figured out, you know, where I could find the Irish, because the translation in that book is still under copyright. And I thought, first of all, I didn't want the text to be sung in English. And then I thought, well, the medieval Irish is, you know, over 1,000 years old, so it's out of copyright. It's pretty safe. No one will be coming looking for royalties or suing me for this one. Yeah, and I really, really love the text. And because it's not in English, I did give myself a license to do a lot of text painting, some of which, so if anybody does follow along as they watch and look at the translation and they hear the sun is low, they're going to hear that is set in the lower register of the men's voices. And over it, you know, the women sing its course is short with these little short phrases. So that's one like shameless example. Also, Higidgaif, which sort of means winter pour, so this idea of cold rain pouring is introduced by this like high soprano line that just sort of pours down, and you sort of hear the rain pouring down. So, and there's a million things like that. So yeah, that is the story of that text, which is a text I still think it's just one of the most gorgeous things ever. Even though it did mean that I had to find a medievalist who had studied at Trinity College Dublin and get her to explain to me how to pronounce medieval Irish. The nice thing about living in New Haven was that I could basically email the Yale Language Center and say, I would like to know how to pronounce a text that's in medieval Irish. And they could say, oh yes, Angie Gleason studied her doctorate at Trinity College Dublin. And I could email her, and she was amazing. And we met twice. And we, you know, the first time we went through everything, you know, just so I would have a sense of stress and like what the consonants and vowels were supposed to sound like. So of course half the time they have nothing to do with what we think they should sound like as English speakers. And then I met with her a second time and we went through, and she read the text, and then I read it, and I read it several times and with her feedback to make a recording, so that's how I made the audio recording of the pronunciation that goes with the score.
So getting back to a sound briefly, I have a quote from a SoundStreams interview from several years ago. And you say, finding the central idea of a piece is a bit harder to describe. It's different with every composition. That little germinal spark doesn't usually come when I'm sitting down trying to compose, but when I'm doing something else, listening to music, washing my hands, praying, riding the bus. The spark is always a sound, though sometimes that sound is connected to a text, emotion, or other extra musical idea I want to incorporate into the piece. So you mentioned there was a sound that just came to you. So can you talk a little bit about what that was and how that grew?
Yeah, that was the washing my hands thing. Like I literally, every one of the examples in there, they aren't just drawn at random, like are examples of something that I was doing when I had an idea that kind of was like, that's what this piece is, or that's what this movement is. So yeah, I was washing my hands, and that's when I just heard the sound of a harp and this cold, wintry kind of atmosphere. And that's when I knew from those sounds somehow also the kind of text that I wanted and the spirit of the piece that I wanted. And of course, from the spark to the finished piece, there is a journey.
Right.
And, you know, a lot of things happened as I was writing it. I got to become a gardener for the first time, which was really exciting. And really gave me this new connection to nature. Right. It felt really meaningful. Also, a friend of mine was dying of cancer as I wrote this. Yeah. So there's a line in this about the bracken reddening. And even though I did not want to write a piece where winter was a metaphor for death, somehow that line and the way I said it just made me think about eternity and nature as kind of a mirror of the divine presence, of divine love, of possibly heaven, if you want to use that phrase. So I wrote it thinking of her because she was in her 40s, so she was, not a young child, but she was still too young to pass away, and she had just gotten married, and she didn't want to go. She wasn't ready to go, and I wrote that kind of feeling like I wanted to somehow comfort her with this vision of eternity. And of course, she died before the piece was performed, so she never heard it. But her husband came to the concert, and although I had never told him any of this, he came up to me with tears in his eyes, and he knew exactly what I was doing, which was kind of amazing.
We just finished our fall concert was all about death and dying, and a local composer had written about the death of she had written two pieces. One was about the death of her father, and one was about the death of her mother, and going through the stages of grief over the course of the piece. And for us working through it, we had singers who were seeing parallels in their own lives, and it was a really meaningful experience. That's an important thing to notice about the piece, and I think that'll make that line really special for a lot of us too, as well as it would for you.
I hope so.
There's a lot of story. For our audience, what should they expect to hear? I mean, you mentioned to me this is a concerto for choir and harp. So what should they expect to hear, and would they be able to recognize that little spark of a sound?
Oh yeah, I hope so. I think there's some wind in the middle. There's a cold wind that blows that you'll hear the choir imitate, and you'll hear a flock of geese fly through about 2/3 the way through, where they sing, the cry that the wild goose is now usual. And in the case of the poem, they're actually talking about a barnacle goose, which is the kind of goose that they would have in Ireland, but I'm Canadian, so the geese that fly through are definitely Canada geese. And so they'll hear that. There's some really fun harp effects that I used. I met with Kristen Tuchko, who's an amazing Canadian harpist who happened to be at Yale when I was working on this piece. And so she spent a good hour with me, and we talked about things like a thunder strike that you'll hear. She demonstrated palm strikes. She demonstrated pitch bends. So all those things ended up in the music. And she, in fact, did play the premiere. She had graduated by that point, but bless Maggie and the Institute of Sacred Music, they paid for Kristen to come down and play the piece at the premiere. So yeah, the harp part is very important. It's equal importance, I would say, to the vocal parts, even as it supports them. It's also really difficult. One of the strange things that's difficult about it is that even though harpists play with two hands, they usually sort of play one thing. So they'll be playing a melody or a nice arpeggiated harmony or a glissando. But in this piece, quite often, the harpist, the hands are very independent, and they're playing sort of in counterpoint to one another, which adds to the many layers of counterpoint that the audience may or may not notice. There are moments when there's, I don't know, like, how many vocal parts are there? There's 8 plus the 2. So there's like 10-part counterpoint at one point in the piece, I think when they're talking about the seas being roiled up, suddenly the little waves happen and there's 10-part counterpoint. Everybody's doing something else and counting madly. So yeah, the harp is, they should hear some really lovely harp playing from your harpist. And I'm excited to hear that too, actually. And yeah, they'll hear a lot of sound effects that maybe suggest cold and winter, and I hope the beauty of the natural world as well.
So you mentioned sexism in music. There was a panel at the Yale School of Music in 2019 on gender inequality in composition, and I wish there was a whole discussion from that, but there's not. There's a few quotes. I have one of your colleagues, Lauren Loyacono, who said, I believe it's important to acknowledge that the canon did not unfold simply because these men were the best composers. There were social forces at play. So I'm curious if you would talk a little bit more about what you said at that panel, and also what steps you think arts organization can take to further address gender inequality in programming and in new music.
Oh, those are big questions. First of all, I think I said way too much at that panel. I had Missy Mazzoli as well on the end as Hannah Lash on the same panel as I was, and they're both. I should have just shut up and let them talk the entire time and said, "I'm just here for the free glass of water. Everybody else talk." So I do regret speaking at all because I think, I mean, if you look, Missy Mazzoli has done amazing work, and Hannah Lash is also just like a brilliant, amazing human and composer. So, as well as Lauren, and everybody on the panel was wonderful. But I think, as I recall, it was a year ago now, but I think the important thing to remember is that most people are not choosing to be sexist or racist or homophobic or any of those things. We live in a culture that is sexist and racist and transphobic and homophobic. And so we don't necessarily choose to have a lot of those beliefs, but we absorb them just in the same way that when we inhale and there's pollution in the air, we get pollution in our lungs. We don't want the pollution to be in there, but in it goes, and it sort of sticks in the tissue. And so it might be wise for us to maybe be patient with ourselves and with other people for sometimes saying or doing things that are pretty terrible, because that happens, because we're humans. That said, it's also important for all of us to listen when somebody tells us, gee, that was maybe not cool, that thing that you said. And I think that is really challenging. We have to all be ready to hear that. And maybe also to try to hear ourselves and try to notice when we have thoughts or say things or behave in ways that reinforce negative stereotypes. So I think there's just a lot of really personal work that needs to happen in terms of all of us examining our biases. I mean, that's not rocket science. A lot of people have said it better than I have, but I do think we all, including me, we all have biases, and we need to examine them and try to work away from them, because that's the only way I think we're really going to make progress. In the meantime, as far as tackling sexism, I do think noticing a bias in programming is important. A lot of people are saying that's not enough, but for me, I think that's a really great place to start, is to look at whose music are we doing, and what, you know, if you're doing a very broadly themed concert with 15 composers and they all happen to be white men, you might not have picked the best music. Yeah. Your biases may have come into play, or the fact that your music history class or your teachers or whatever taught you only this canon full of white guys. You might not know all this other great music that maybe would have suited your program even better than what you did. Yeah. So I think being really careful about programming and seeking out composers who aren't white, who aren't necessarily male, and being open to maybe trying things of different genres. But even if you don't go outside the really strict classical genre, there's incredible music by people of all different kinds of backgrounds and gender identities. And so you just have to look for it sometimes. It is a little extra work of research, but maybe it's just me. I kind of like that. Like, I really like looking and discovering new music and like digging around and listening to different things and figuring out what I like. So I'd say as musicians, we need to kind of maybe do a bit of that, whether we're teaching and we're using our music to illustrate a point in music theory or music history, or whether we're planning a concert. Just kind of be mindful, step back and take a look for your biases, question them. And then I think this is well beyond, you know, as a composer, I don't run an ensemble, but I think sometimes it's useful to look around an ensemble and think, do we all look alike? If that's the case, is there a way maybe we could invite people in and hear other perspectives and other voices, and be more welcoming to the talents of people who are a bit different, who are going to bring something else to the experience musically. And again, when I hear sexism and racism defended, it's always with the excuse of, oh, well, we just care about quality. And I can only say, no, you don't. Yeah. Because there's so much great music and so many great musicians out there who are not all white. They aren't all men. They aren't necessarily women either. They may be gender fluid, but I think it's really important for us to kind of open our eyes and look and try to find those people, because again, everybody else's biases may have come between us and the opportunity to know their music. So as we fight our own biases, we also have to kind of work against this larger trend and say, well, who else is out there? And some of those people might be alive and some of them might be dead. And I think the fact that Barbara Strozzi is dead doesn't make her music any less amazing. I think that really there's just a world of talented people and amazing music that people of my generation and older generations maybe did not really encounter at university or in our education. So it's important for us especially to go out there and look and listen and find all this great stuff. And there will be stuff in there we don't like. Just like there is, like, I don't like every piece every white dude wrote. I'm not gonna like every piece everybody else writes, but I will when I expand my horizons. I can tell you I've found lots of pieces that are amazing and have worked really well in terms of composition pedagogy, or that I've really enjoyed singing when other people have programmed them.
You touched a bit there on collaboration, which is one of Intima's favorite words, but it's you want to use quality as an argument that doesn't hold up when you don't have to say that everyone has to sing like you, right? Or everyone has to write like you. Then you can find a new collaboration and work in a different way. I think, and if you want to talk about quality, then that means you need systems change if you're not able to find the quality that you're looking for, right? Like,
yes, and that's something I didn't totally mention, because that definitely taps into the wider world of politics, especially, I mean, living in the US for so many years. It's the socioeconomic differences are exaggerated compared to what they are in Canada, and a lot of those line up with race. There's just a parfait of racism. It's like a poop parfait of racism that keeps a lot of people out of the concert hall, either as performers, composers, or even audience members. And there's a lot of different layers, and it's definitely much bigger than my personal attitude. There's a huge amount of work that needs to happen on a societal level, and to a certain extent also for women generally. I think I've sort of given up on academia, but I think that the academy is not terribly friendly still to women scholars and women composers, and just women in general. And I think there are systemic things that could happen. There are ways that they could change the tenure process. There are ways that they could change the hiring process. Once people have a job, there are certain benefits that could be offered in terms of like childcare or that kind of thing that would also actually benefit men. So there are a lot of things that could be changed, but those are huge things. And past my circle of expertise as a composer, I am not a social scientist or an economist or politician or anything like that. But you don't need to be any of those things to see that the things are not working the way they should. People are not given equal opportunity, and they should have equal opportunities to explore whatever they're called to explore.